3 words. That's all it took to change the direction of an entire conversation. 3 words spoken quietly, without arrogance, without performance, in a briefing room at a joint training facility where the walls were still plastered with the laminated checklists and assessment rubrics that the American Army had spent decades refining into something approaching institutional gospel. The British warrant officer had been sitting in silence for most of the session, listening, nodding occasionally, watching a PowerPoint presentation on leadership development that the U.S. Army had used in some form since 1951. He was not a loud man. He was not a confrontational man. His uniform was immaculate, but carried no unnecessary decoration, no flag of rank beyond what regulations required. When he finally leaned forward and spoke, the room didn't go quiet dramatically the way rooms do in films. It just slowly, naturally, stopped. You're teaching them the wrong things. What followed that statement lasted approximately 40 minutes. By the end of it, the senior American officer present had stopped taking notes and was simply listening. A training doctrine that had been largely unchanged for over 60 years, a doctrine taught to hundreds of thousands of American soldiers, a doctrine marketed as the premier leadership course in the most powerful military on earth, was being methodically, professionally, and completely dismantled. Not by an enemy, not by a rival, by an ally who had spent nearly 3 decades producing a specific kind of soldier, a kind of soldier the American training system did not know how to build, and in many cases did not yet understand that it needed. This is that story. It is not a simple story about one course or one critique. It is a story about 2 countries, 2 militaries, 2 philosophies of what a soldier fundamentally is and what he needs to be capable of doing. It is a story about the gap between training that creates obedient competence and training that creates autonomous excellence. And it is a story that begins, as so many of the defining stories in British military history begin, in a muddy field in England before dawn. Before you can understand what the British warrant officer was saying in that briefing room, you have to understand what the British Army was producing, and specifically what the Parachute Regiment was producing, long before it walked into any joint training environment alongside Americans. The Parachute Regiment is not simply elite infantry in the way that most nations use the phrase. It is the product of a selection system that has been described by soldiers from dozens of armies as the most psychologically aggressive infantry selection process in the Western world. One that does not select for the strongest or the fastest, but for something far harder to define and far more difficult to replicate. The process is called pre-parachute selection, run by Pegasus Company, known throughout the British Army simply as P Company, or P-Coy. It is based at the Infantry Training Center in Catterick, North Yorkshire, and every soldier who wishes to serve in the Parachute Regiment or in a parachute role within 16 Air Assault Brigade must pass through it. There are no waivers, no bypasses, no substitutions. Special Forces selection exempts you from the requirement, not because P-Coy is considered less demanding than Special Forces selection, but because anyone who has already survived Special Forces selection has already proven the underlying qualities P-Coy exists to find. What P-Coy tests, and what makes it categorically different from almost every other military selection process in the world, is not primarily physical strength. The physical demands are extreme, but they are the vehicle for something else. P-Coy tests what the British Army calls moral courage under conditions of sustained stress, fear, and fatigue. It is looking for a very specific kind of human being, one who does not crumble when his body is screaming, when fear is rational, when stopping would be the sensible choice, and when no external structure exists to compel him to continue. The course culminates in test week, 8 events conducted over 4.5 days that together cover approximately 64 kilometers of undulating terrain carrying progressively increasing loads. Each event is designed to isolate and expose a particular weakness in human psychology. The 10-miler opens the sequence. Candidates carry a Bergen weighing 35 pounds plus a rifle across 10 miles of Yorkshire terrain, completed as a squad within 1 hour and 50 minutes. The time limit is known. The terrain is not. Every candidate knows that 60 seconds past the cutoff and they are done. There is no second attempt within that course cycle. One moment of decision, one choice to stop, and 3 months of build-up training means nothing. The trinasium follows, an aerial confidence course 60 feet above the ground, unique in the world to Pequot. The structure tests one thing with absolute clarity. Can you operate functionally when your brain is flooding your body with a fear response? It is a pass or fail event. There is no partial credit. Candidates who freeze at height, who cannot follow simple instructions while their nervous system is demanding retreat, fail immediately. Not because height is intrinsically important to airborne soldiering, though it is, but because the ability to execute a rational task while experiencing a genuine fear response is the core competency that close-quarters combat, house clearance, night operations, and every other high-stress military event requires. The log race strips away individual performance entirely and replaces it with collective suffering. 8 candidates carry a 60-kilogram log, a real telegraph pole, over 1.9 miles of undulating ground. The weight is distributed across 8 men, which means 8 men who cannot afford to fail, who cannot afford to rest, who cannot withdraw from the effort without forcing the weight onto the others. Men fall off the log regularly. The survivors carry on. Points are awarded for determination, aggression, and leadership visible under that specific kind of duress. Not leadership in a classroom. Not leadership described on paper. Leadership demonstrated in the moment when every physiological instinct is demanding that you put the log down. The milling is perhaps the most famous and the most misunderstood event in British military selection. 60 seconds of controlled physical aggression against an opponent of similar height and weight. Candidates wear boxing gloves and head guards. The rules are simple. You must move forward, you must engage with aggression, and you must not show pain or fear regardless of what your opponent does to you. It is explicitly not a boxing contest. Technique is irrelevant. What is being measured with brutal and undeniable clarity is whether this individual possesses what the British Army calls aggressive determination, the willingness to impose yourself physically and psychologically on an adversary regardless of personal discomfort. Many physically larger and objectively stronger candidates fail the milling. Many lighter, leaner candidates pass it with distinction. The outcome has almost nothing to do with the body and almost everything to do with what occupies the mind. The stretcher race closes the sequence. 16 candidates carry a stretcher loaded to 175 pounds across 5 miles. No more than 4 men carry it at any time. The rotation is constant. By this point in test week, candidates are operating on depleted glycogen reserves, accumulated muscle damage, and whatever psychological resource they began the course with. The stretcher race is not testing fitness. It is testing what remains when fitness has already been spent. The overall attrition rate for P Company varies by cycle, but across all cohorts, the majority of candidates who begin do not pass. In regular Parachute Regiment recruit intakes, figures indicate that between 30 and 50% of those who attempt test week fail to complete it to the required standard. For all arms candidates, soldiers from other regiments who volunteer for airborne service, the numbers are broadly similar. These are not volunteers who arrived unprepared. They are soldiers who in many cases have already served years in the British Army, who arrived at Catterick physically and mentally prepared for the hardest thing they had ever attempted. And a majority of them still do not make it. What Pequot produces is not a soldier who has learned new tactical skills. The course teaches nothing in that sense. What it produces is a soldier who has been tested to a personal extreme and discovered with complete certainty that he can function when everything in him is telling him to stop. This is not a trivial quality. It is, in combat environments, the most important quality a human being can possess, because the decision to continue moving, to continue thinking, to continue executing under fire, under exhaustion, under fear, is not a decision that training can make for you. It can only be a decision that you have already made before the moment arrives by having been tested to the point where you know your own response. The British Army calls this quality determination. The Parachute Regiment calls it the airborne spirit. Military psychologists who have studied it call it resilience under sustained stress. Whatever the name, it is the foundation of everything that followed when the Parachute Regiment was deployed to places like the Falkland Islands, Northern Ireland, Iraq, and Afghanistan's Helmand Province, and it is the quality that the British warrant officer was trying to explain in that briefing room when he said, "You're teaching them the wrong things." The U.S. Army Ranger School has existed in its current form since 1951, created in the aftermath of the Korean War when General J. Lawton Collins, the Army Chief of Staff, recognized that Ranger companies trained in intensive small unit tactics had delivered combat results so disproportionate to their size that the principles behind that training needed to be extended across the broader force. What he ordered was a school, a 62-day course divided into 3 phases, Benning, Mountain, and Florida, that would take officers and senior NCOs and put them through physically and mentally demanding conditions designed to replicate the stress of extended dismounted infantry combat. The description used by the Army itself is worth sitting with. Ranger School is described as the Army's premier combat leadership course, teaching students how to overcome fatigue, hunger, and stress to lead soldiers in small unit combat operations. That description has been reproduced in essentially the same language for decades. It appears on the Army's official website. It is referenced in promotion boards, career counseling sessions, and officer efficiency reports across every branch of service. Completing Ranger School and earning the Ranger tab, worn on the upper left shoulder of the uniform, has become one of the most institutionally significant markers in the American Army. Officers without the tab face invisible ceilings. NCOs who carry it earn instant credibility. The tab says, in the shorthand of American military culture, that this person has been tested. And here's where the philosophical difference begins, because the tab does not exist in British military culture in the same way. It does not exist at all. In fact, the British Army does not manufacture institutional credibility through the completion of a discrete school. It manufactures it through operational service and the accumulated reputation of a regiment. An officer in the Parachute Regiment is not asked whether he has completed a particular course. He is asked what he has done and what those who served with him say about him. The American Army, by contrast, has built an enormous and internally coherent system of credentialing. Ranger School, Air Assault School, Airborne School, the Pathfinder Course, Sapper School. The list of tabs, badges, and braids that can be acquired over a career is extensive, and each carries institutional weight. This is not a cynical observation. The system was built to address a genuine problem in a large military bureaucracy: how do you signal competence and resilience across an organization of over 1 million soldiers? The answer the American Army arrived at was standardized schools with standardized outcomes and standardized insignia that any officer on a promotion board could read at a glance. The problem, the one the British warrant officer was articulating, is that the system mistakes the symbol for the substance. Ranger School does not produce Rangers in the same sense that P Company produces Paris. Ranger School is a course that any U.S. Army soldier, and indeed soldiers from Allied militaries and other service branches, can attend. Officers who attend it may have no intention of ever serving in the 75th Ranger Regiment. They attend because the tab is a career accelerant. Because the institutional machinery of promotion rewards its presence and, by implication, penalizes its absence. And this reality has produced something that is not inherently dishonest but is functionally distorting. A school designed to test leadership under stress has been absorbed by a culture of credentialism that prioritizes completion over character. This is not a recent critique from outside the American military. It is a debate that has been conducted within the U.S. Army itself for decades. Military academic institutions and the Army's own professional journals have published analyses questioning whether Ranger School, as brilliant as it is in isolation, is being used in a way its original architects never intended. The fundamental tension is this: Ranger School was designed to test whether a leader can function under prolonged physical and mental stress. It was not designed to teach leadership in any formal sense. Ranger instructors do not give lectures on leadership theory. There are no workshops on decision-making frameworks or ethical dilemmas under pressure. What the school does is place candidates in conditions of genuine hardship and evaluate how they perform. The candidates who complete it have proven something real and significant. But the credential the completion generates has been given an institutional weight that implies far more than the course actually produces. The British warrant officer had watched this system operate in joint exercises and coalition operations. He had watched American officers arrive at forward operating bases with their Ranger tabs and their air assault badges and their stacked credentials, and he had watched some of them perform with extraordinary skill and judgment and genuine leadership presence, and he had watched others perform with a kind of brittle competence that collapsed under conditions the school had not specifically trained for. Conditions that had nothing to do with fatigue or hunger, but everything to do with the kind of autonomous decision-making that modern counterinsurgency operations demand at the lowest levels of command. The distinction he was drawing was not between brave men and cowardly ones. It was between a training system that prepares soldiers to perform within a known framework under predictable forms of stress, and a training system that prepares soldiers to improvise effectively within unknown frameworks under unpredictable forms of stress. Ranger School does the former magnificently. The British system, beginning with P Company and extending through the Parachute Regiment's operational training and ethos, was built to do the latter. The evidence for this distinction was not theoretical. It was operational, written in the performance of British Paras across 3 generations of actual combat, beginning with an island chain in the South Atlantic in 1982. The Falklands War lasted 74 days. It was fought at the end of an 8,000-mile logistics chain against an Argentine force that in places outnumbered the British attackers across terrain that combined the worst features of the Welsh uplands and the North Yorkshire moors with the added advantages of entrenched prepared positions, minefields, and artillery. The British force had no pre-positioned supply chain. It had no established air superiority. It had limited armor, limited artillery, and in several key engagements, limited artillery support at all. What it had was the Parachute Regiment. At Goose Green on the 28th of May 1982, approximately 690 soldiers of the 2nd Battalion, Parachute Regiment, attacked a prepared Argentine position held by over 1,000 defenders, supported by artillery, anti-aircraft weapons, and fixed-wing aircraft. The Argentine position had been prepared over weeks. The British attackers had marched through the night and attacked at dawn with limited fire support, in phases that became increasingly improvised as the battle developed. The commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Herbert Jones, was killed leading from the front after the attack stalled, moving personally to break through a position that was pinning down his companies. His death led to Major Chris Keeble assuming command mid-battle and continuing the attack to a conclusion that resulted in the surrender of the Argentine garrison and the capture of 2 settlements. The battle was objectively insane by the calculus of military planning. A force of fewer than 700 men attacking a force of over 1,000 in prepared positions with limited fire support does not succeed in any war game simulation. It does not succeed if you model it on paper with the variables plugged into a planning matrix. It succeeded because 2nd Para was carrying something that no planning matrix can account for, the absolute individual certainty earned through P Company and years of regimental culture that stopping was not an option, that the mission would be completed regardless of what the opposition offered. At Mount Longdon 11 days later, 3 Paras' attack on a heavily defended Argentine position overlooking the approaches to Port Stanley produced some of the most intense close-quarters fighting since the Second World War. The Argentine defenders of the 7th Infantry Regiment were not conscripts in the way the word is sometimes used dismissively. They were soldiers who fought with genuine determination, turning every building, every crevice in the rock face, every prepared position into a separate small battle. Sergeant Ian McKay, killed while personally leading an assault on a machine gun position that was pinning down his section, was awarded a posthumous Victoria Cross. The battle cost 30 para 23 killed and approximately 60 wounded. The Argentine defenders lost 31 killed, 120 wounded, and 50 captured. 3 para held the mountain. In both engagements, what defined the outcome was not superior equipment. The Argentines had comparable weapons. It was not numerical superiority. The numbers favored the defenders. It was not air support or fire support or any of the assets that conventional military doctrine says you need before you commit infantry to an assault on a prepared position. It was what Picoy had built into every man in those battalions, the unconditional refusal to accept that any problem, however severe, was a reason to stop. What the Falklands also demonstrated, and what is frequently overlooked when the campaign is discussed in terms of heroism and gallantry, was the extraordinary degree of tactical initiative exercised at the lowest levels of command. When Lieutenant Colonel Jones was killed at Darwin Hill, the battalion did not stop and wait for higher authority to reorganize the chain of command. The officers and NCOs on the ground assessed the situation and continued the attack. This was not insubordination. It was a fundamental reflex built by a regimental culture that said, in every context and without qualification, that the mission was the responsibility of every man in the unit regardless of rank, and that the absence of command authority was not an excuse for inaction, but an opportunity for individual leadership. This is the quality that the British warrant officer was trying to isolate when he sat in that briefing room and said the Americans were teaching the wrong things. Not tactics. Not physical standards, not even the broad concept of resilience under stress. He was pointing at something more specific and more difficult to name: the cultural transmission of autonomous mission ownership from the institution to the individual. The belief, instilled from the first day of training and reinforced by every subsequent test, that the soldier himself is responsible for the outcome, not the system supporting him. And that when the system fails, as systems always eventually do in combat, the soldier is both equipped and expected to find another way. 2 decades later, in the Sangin Valley of Helmand Province, Afghanistan, 3 para faced a different kind of war and demonstrated the same quality under conditions that in some respects were more psychologically demanding than the Falklands. In the Falklands, the enemy was in front of you. In Sangin in 2006, the enemy was everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, appearing as civilian one moment and fighter the next, planting devices that could not be seen, firing from positions that could not be identified, and melting back into a civilian population that British soldiers were specifically and correctly ordered to protect. A company, 3 para, was positioned in a compound in Sangin and subjected to sustained Taliban attacks that at points came several times per day. With approximately 90 men, they defended their position using mortars, heavy machine guns, and rifles against a force that had the advantages of ground knowledge, civilian cover, and attrition strategy. The Taliban did not need to defeat a company in a single battle. They needed only to wait, to wear down, to inflict casualties that accumulated into a political price the British government could not sustain. What a company demonstrated in that environment had almost nothing in common with what Ranger School teaches. The challenges they faced were not the challenges of a fixed exercise scenario with defined phases and evaluated patrol orders. The challenges were relentless, unpredictable, and required constant small unit decision-making at every level, from section commander down to the individual private soldier. A 20-year-old para-corporal in Sangin was routinely making decisions under fire that would have required field-grade officer approval in a conventional military planning cycle. He was making them in seconds, alone, without air support, without satellite imagery, without the information architecture that American Special Operations Doctrine required before action was authorized. He could make those decisions because P. Coy had already tested him to the point where he knew what kind of person he was, because the parachute regiment's culture had communicated, over years of training and service, that the regiment's expectation was autonomous excellence under stress, not procedural compliance. The tab on the shoulder, the badge on the beret, the maroon color that is among the most recognizable symbols in the British Army did not signify the completion of a school. It signified membership in a regiment with an unbroken tradition of doing impossible things because nobody told them they were impossible. The British regimental system itself is worth pausing on, because it is an organizational structure that American military culture has never fully replicated and has at times looked at with genuine puzzlement. Regiments in the British Army are not just administrative units, they are families in the most functional sense of that word. A soldier who joins the Parachute Regiment does not join the British Army in any meaningful psychological sense. He joins the Paris. His identity, his pride, his professional standard, and his sense of accountability are all organized around a unit that has an unbroken institutional memory stretching back to 1940. A unit with specific battles on its flag, specific dead on its walls, specific standards that existed before he arrived and will exist long after he has left. This creates a form of accountability that no external credentialing system can replicate. An American officer can attend Ranger School, earn his tab, and serve the remainder of his career in a different branch, in which the tab functions as a career marker but carries no ongoing cultural obligation. A para cannot leave his regiment's standards behind when it becomes convenient. The regiment will remember. His section will remember. The standard is not embodied in a piece of cloth on his shoulder. It is embodied in the regiment itself, which is alive, watching, and holds its own members to account in ways that are informal, constant, and utterly non-negotiable. This is the distinction the British warrant officer was drawing. Not that Ranger School was worthless, not that American soldiers were inferior. The relationship between British and American soldiers who have served alongside each other, from the Falklands to Iraq to Afghanistan, is one of genuine mutual respect and in many cases genuine friendship. The 75th Ranger Regiment, JSOC, Delta Force, the Green Berets, these are forces of extraordinary capability, and the British military establishment acknowledges this without qualification. The distinction was philosophical and structural. The American system had built a culture in which the credential was mistaken for the characteristic, in which completing a school was understood to be the same as possessing the quality the school was designed to find. And this mistake, multiplied across a military of hundreds of thousands of officers and NCOs, produced a subtle but significant distortion in how leadership was understood, selected, and developed. Ranger School, in its pure form, tests something real. The 62 days across Benning, the mountains of Georgia, and the swamps of Florida genuinely separate those who can function under prolonged stress from those who cannot. The candidates who complete it are not faking their performance. They are genuinely tested and genuinely resilient. But the school is open to the entire Army. It is not a selection process in the way P. Coy is a selection process. P. Coy is not a school you attend to earn a badge for your uniform. It is a gate. You pass it, and you are in the regiment. You fail it, and you are not. The distinction is existential, not cosmetic, and it creates a fundamentally different relationship between the soldier and his performance. A para who completes P. Coy has not earned a badge he will wear for the rest of his career, regardless of subsequent performance. He has earned the right to be a para, which is renewed by continued service, continued operational contribution, and continued adherence to a standard that never formally closes. The culture of the regiment is self-policing in a way that a credential system simply cannot replicate. You cannot coast on P. Coy. Your section knows whether you are the man who carries the weight or the man who watches others carry it. Your platoon sergeant knows. Your commanding officer knows. The regiment is small enough and close enough that performance and character are visible in a way they are not in a force of hundreds of thousands. The British warrant officer was not suggesting that the U.S. Army should abolish Ranger School. He was suggesting something more precise and, in its way, more challenging, that the Army needed to be honest with itself about what the school actually produced versus what it was being used to represent, that the institutional machinery of tabs and credentials had quietly replaced the harder work of selecting and developing character as a continuous process rather than a discrete event, that the result was an officer and ENCO corps that was, by external measures, highly credentialed and in many specific environments and by many honest internal assessments, occasionally deficient in exactly the quality that the tab was supposed to represent. The quality of autonomous decision-making under novel stress. The quality of acting without a checklist when the checklist has been invalidated by reality. The quality of looking at a situation that no doctrine has specifically accounted for and doing the right thing anyway because your judgment has been built from the ground up over years of genuine testing, not from the top down by 62 days of evaluated patrol orders. There is a particular kind of institutional courage required to hear a critique like this and sit with it honestly rather than defending reflexively. It is the same courage P Company tries to find in candidates, the willingness to acknowledge a hard truth without flinching from it. And to the credit of those present in that briefing room, there was more of it than the warrant officer might have expected. The response to this critique, both in that briefing room and in the broader history of American engagement with British military culture, was not straightforward. There was defensiveness, as there always is when a deeply entrenched institution is questioned. There was also genuine receptiveness, because the American military, at its best, is an institution of genuine intellectual honesty, capable of absorbing critique and evolving in response to it, something its history demonstrates repeatedly. The honest internal debate within the U.S. Army about Ranger School's purpose and its relationship to real leadership development has been ongoing for years and shows no sign of resolution. It runs through the professional journals and the military education classrooms and the informal conversations between senior NCOs who have both worn the tab and watched what it does and does not predict about performance in the field. The debate is not about whether the school is hard. It obviously is. It is about what hardness, in isolation, actually proves. The British position, built across generations of institutional experience, beginning in the North African desert in 1941 and refined through Malaya, Borneo, Oman, Northern Ireland, the Falklands, Sierra Leone, Iraq, and Afghanistan, is that hardness is necessary, but not sufficient. That what you are looking for in a soldier, and specifically in the soldiers who will carry the weight when the situation becomes genuinely desperate, is not the ability to complete a defined and bounded period of intense training. It is the willingness, at the cellular level, to continue when there is no defined end, no evaluation rubric, no external authority compelling forward movement, when the only thing that keeps you moving is who you already are. P Company does not guarantee that. No selection process guarantees anything about future performance in all environments. But PCOI does something that 62 days of evaluated patrol leadership cannot do. It removes, permanently and clearly, the option of hiding behind a credential. Apara knows what he proved at PCOI. He knows which event nearly broke him. He knows what it cost him to pass the milling, to carry that log up the last hill when his shoulders had nothing left. And he knows, with a certainty that no certificate can confer, that when the moment comes again, when the environment is genuinely desperate and nobody is coming to help, he has been in a version of that place before. And he came through it. That knowledge lives in the body differently from a tab sewn onto a sleeve. It cannot be photographed for a promotion board or summarized on an officer efficiency report. But in a drainage ditch in Ramadi, in a fire trench on Mount Longdon, in a compound in Sangin with mortars falling and ammunition running short, it is the only thing that actually matters. The British warrant officer leaned back when he had finished, The room was quiet for a moment, not the uncomfortable quiet of a confrontation that had gone too far, but the particular quiet of an idea that has landed somewhere it cannot be easily dislodged from. The senior American officer finally nodded slowly and said something that has been quoted in slightly different forms by several of those present. He said, "You might be right. That was not a surrender. It was not a concession of inferiority. It was the acknowledgement of something genuine and important and difficult to argue with, that the hardest thing to build in a soldier, the only thing that ultimately matters when every other resource has been exhausted, is not tactical skill or physical fitness or an impressive row of badges. It is the knowledge, self-tested and self-earned and beyond the reach of any institution to grant, that he is the kind of person who does not stop." The Parachute Regiment has been building that person for over 80 years. The process is brutal, expensive in human terms, and deliberately and completely non-negotiable. It produces soldiers who in the Falklands won battles that should have been lost, who in Helmand held positions that should not have been held, who in Iraq operated with a freedom of individual judgment that generations of institutional culture had earned them the right to exercise. The warrant officer had not traveled across the Atlantic to insult American soldiers. He had traveled because he believed, professionally and sincerely, that the question of how you build the specific kind of human being that warfare at its most extreme requires was a question worth having honestly. Not a question of national pride. Not a competition. A question with real stakes and a real answer, and an answer that no credential, however hard-won, can substitute for. You're teaching them the wrong things, not the wrong skills, not the wrong tactics, the wrong relationship between an individual soldier and the institution that claims to have prepared him, the wrong assumption that completion of a defined challenge is the same as possession of an indefinite quality, the wrong idea that a tab can tell you who a man is in the moment, that his character is the last thing standing between mission success and catastrophic failure. The right thing, the thing the Parachute Regiment had built its entire identity around since the day the first candidate stood on the trinasium and looked down 60 feet at the ground below and chose to continue, was something far simpler and far more demanding than any school could manufacture in 62 days. It was the answer to a question that selection forces a man to ask himself and that combat eventually asks every soldier, regardless of the badges on his chest. When there is nothing left and everything is asking you to stop, what are you? The para already knows his answer. That is why they sent him.